Morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
Good morning, Rabbi.
We are learning Mishnah Shabbos, Perek Yud Aleph, Chapter 11, Mishnah Beis, Mishnah 2. I'd like to dedicate this morning's learning in memory of my mother, Mr. Shalamis Rabinowitz, Shalamis Rabbi Yaakov Eliezer. Should be a schus for her neshama.
Amen.
Okay, so the previous Mishnah had said that if you throw something from a private domain to another private domain through a public domain, we came out. And again, it didn't land in the public domain, but it started in the private domain, flew through the public domain, and landed again in the private domain. So we had an argument in the Mishnah between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim whether one is liable for that or not. Is that called Haitzah? Is that doing the Malacha of Haitzah on Shabbos? So now the Mishnah elaborates on that. Ketzad, how? What's the case here? So it says like this: Shtei gezus terois, zu keneged zu. You've got two balconies. One opposite the other, Bershus Harabim, in a public domain. Okay. Hamoishit v'hazarik mizay l'zay pater. If you hand over or you throw from one to the other, you're going to be exempt. Now, you have pictures here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I can't tell you from this part which pictures are what, but I have a feeling it's the one to the right. Well, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, again, if you want to follow this one,
Mm-hmm.
okay, here you've got your picture.
Mm-hmm.
You got the two balconies,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you have the Bershus Harabim that's going through. So the two balconies. Now, each balcony is considered a private domain. Why? Because it's closed in on four sides,
Mm-hmm.
and the walls are 10 tefachim high, 10 handbreadths, like 40 inches high. Okay, and therefore they're both private domains. And now when you go ahead and you throw the object, it's going through the public domain. And as we said last time, it's got to be within 10 tefachim of the ground, since there's nothing actually standing in the Rishus Harabim. That's the case. So we say like this: if in either of these cases, right, you threw something
Mm-hmm.
or you handed it over,
If it was that
long stretch. That'd be kind of, I don't know how you do that exactly, but if you were to hand it over or throw it from one to the other, you would be. So again, the Chachamim say you're exempt. The sages in the previous said you're exempt. Why? Because since it never landed in the Rishus Harabim, just went through it.
Mm-hmm.
We don't say that the fact that it's, so to speak, taken into this public domain, it's as if it landed there. Klita mishahuncha. You don't say that, and therefore you are exempt in either of these cases, whether you hand it over or you throw it over. Now, first of all, just, practically speaking, when you're handing it over, it could very well be that you have cases where you have call it the main public thoroughfare that's 16 amas wide, 16 cubits wide. Mm-hmm. Then you have other parts that kind of like extend out of it that are not that wide, but are considered part of the Rishus Harabim. That's how you could hand it over. Handing over something 16 cubits is pretty tough. But there could be areas where the Rishus Harabim narrows, and it's still a Rishus Harabim, and therefore that's where it'll be possible to hand it over. Now that's going to be very important for the next case. Hayu shteyen biyuta achas. Let's say both these balconies were coming out of the same upper level. Okay, that means like this. Take a look at this picture, if you can see it.
Mm-hmm.
Right here, the balconies are side by side.
Yep.
It's not one balcony on one side of the street and another balcony on the other side of the street.
Mm-hmm.
They're both on the same side of the street.
Mm-hmm.
They're both extending out of an upper level of a building, but the space in between that's below them is Rishus Harabim, is a public domain. So now the two balconies are going along the length of the public domain instead of going over its width.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now, hayu shtei b'dyuta achas. If both balconies were on, let's call it the same side, hamayshit chayiv. If you pass over from one to the other, you'll be liable. That will be considered transferring. That transferring from a private to a private through a public will be considered haitzah. It'll be liable for it. You have to bring it.
Even though you're above it?
Even though you're above it. Good point. Even though you're going to be above 10 tefachim of the ground, if they're on the same side, then we say that handing over the Rishus Harabim or through handing over or through the Rishus Harabim will make you liable, but if you throw it, you will not. Okay, so in this case, where you have it on the same side, if I hand over from one balcony to the other, that's called Haitzah. That's called transferring from domain to domain. But if I throw it, then not. Now, hold on. Let's read on further. Shekach Haisa Avodas HaLeviim, because this was the labor of the Levium. Now, we're talking about how when the Jewish people were in the desert and they had the Mishkan, the tabernacle, which was portable. They used to take it apart, and move it when they had to go from place to place. The job of those who took apart the Mishkan was the job of the Levium. That was their job. It was their job to take it apart and load it onto wagons. I mean, this part of the Mishkan, that was what they did, right? There are other parts of the Mishkan, like the Ark, the Aron, and the table, they were carried. But here we're going to be talking about the beams of the Mishkan that created the walls. The way this was done was the Levium took it apart, and then they loaded it onto wagons, and actually they handed it over to one Levi and then to another Levi. Now, what it means is like this. Now, here again, we got to go into pictures. I can't do these pictures. Yeah, I could do this picture. It's not so bad. All right. Now, in this picture, okay, this is you have 4 wagons. They used a total of 4 wagons for transporting the beams. Okay, really should gotta show my so the viewers also if they can see it through this. Okay, right here you have 4 wagons, one in front of the other on 2 sides. So what would happen? And these wagons, even though according to this picture, I'm not sure how it works, but these wagons, each one was a Rishus Hayach, was a private domain. It had 4 walls. It was considered having 4 walls. It was 4 by its area was 4 by 4 tvachim, was more than 16 square handbreadths, and therefore it constituted a private domain. Now, what would happen would be is that you would have the Levium that were taking apart the Mishkan. Then you had Levium that were standing in one wagon, meaning you had a Levi, you had a Levi actually in each wagon. Okay. And you would go from the Levi who was taking apart the Mishkan, would then hand it to the Levi standing in one wagon, in the wagon that's in front, and the wagon that's first. And then that Levi would hand it to another Levi in the wagon in front of him, and then lay it out. And then eventually, when that, my understanding would be once the front wagon was filled up, then the front one was filled up with the boards, with the beams.
But you didn't have beams going from one to the other.
No. See, in this picture, I don't know about that. This picture is hard to see, but you see the way the beams are lying on the wagon, right? They're lying across the wagon.
That's what it is.
Right? There are beams on each wagon. It's not like the 2 wagons together, the beam across both wagons. Each one of the wagons held beams. Okay. So now the point is that, so let's read. And this was the work, the labor of the Levium, of the Levites. You had 2 wagons, one after the other in a public domain. Because in this picture, you have the wagon, one wagon, another wagon in front of it. And where are those wagons situated? In a public domain. There's going to be space, a public domain in between the wagons. Okay. Now, they would hand over the beams one to the other. They didn't throw them. They were too big for throwing. So there was no throwing being done. There was only handing over being done. And in what way was it being handed over? Not across, right? But in front, where they're on the same side. So what happens here in when it comes to Haitzah is that Haitzah is considered a unique type of the 39 primary forms of prohibited work on Shabbos. Haitzah is considered in certain ways, this might be a good word to use if I'm going to use it. It's in some ways it's the weakest. And this is explained in a number of different ways, because think about it, right? You're transferring from domain to domain. But the only time we say domain to domain is private to a public, right? We have other domains where we said it doesn't apply. So you've got here an activity of transferring domains, and it's limited to certain types of domains.
Mhm.
So that kind of now makes it the kind of malacha, of work, that's not as typical of the other ones. And therefore, its definition follows strictly what went, or more. It'll be, in order to now define what's considered this malach or not. It's by here going to be very important that it should be practically the same as what happened in the Mishkan. That's why before we said, if you throw something from a private domain to public domain, you're liable, right?
Mhm.
Now, there was no throwing by the Levium. They didn't throw then. But when you're going from a private domain to a public domain, which is, clear one from the one to the other. So there we say throwing is like transferring. But now we're talking about a little bit of a different case, right? We're talking about private domain to a private domain through a public domain, and it's even above 10, as you said before. It's not following the typical rules, at least this case. Plus the fact that Hoitzah, we consider it a bit different than the other malachas, than the other activities that are forbidden. And therefore, this case has to match the Levium exactly. If the Levium didn't throw it, then that's not the malacha. That's why here, specifically in this case, where we're talking about from the private domain to the private domain through the public domain, it's got to be exactly like what the Levium did. It's got to be exactly like the way it was done regarding construction regarding the Mishkan. Therefore, they have to be on the same side of each other,
Mhm.
and you can't throw it. You got to hand it over. Okay, so that's what comes out. If we're talking about you're throwing from or even handing over from a private domain through a public domain, but it's over the width of the public domain, according to Torah law, you did nothing. You didn't desecrate Shabbos. But the same thing could become a desecration of Shabbos if it follows what happened regarding the construction of the Mishkan, in this case, how it was taken apart and then constructed again. And for that, we only found that side by side, on the same side, when the private domains are on the same side, and you hand it over and not throw it.
Mhm.
Okay? That's the end of that discussion.
Is this from?
I'm not finished yet.
From at Sinai.
What do you mean?
Uh,
The 39 Avos Malachas follow the pattern of what went on by the construction of the Mishkan.
Okay.
That's what they follow.
All right.
All right. Now, new case. Still in the same Mishnah. New case. Choyas Habar Vahasela. You've got earth removed from a pit. We'll explain what that means soon. And a large rock. Shein Gavai, or and a rock. Shein Gavai and Asara, they're 10 Tvachim high, around 40 inches high. V'rachim and Arba, they have a width of 4 by 4 Tvachim. Hanoito mehen v'anoitzen al gaban chayev. If you take from them or put on top of them, you're going to be liable. It's considered that you, and now again, it's considered you're standing in the public domain, right? And this rock or this pit, we'll talk about what this pit looks like exactly, you're standing in the public domain, and this rock is sitting in the public domain, or this pit is in the public domain. But they have the dimensions of either 10 Tvachim high, or 10 Tvachim, they have the dimensions of 10 Tvachim high or 10 Tvachim deep, with an area of 4 by 4 Tvachim. That constitutes a private domain. And therefore, if you take from them, from what's sitting on this rock or in this pit, and you put it down in the public domain, or you take something from the public domain and put it on them, which means going from a public domain to a private domain, chayiv. You're going to be liable for transferring from a public domain into a private domain or vice versa. Pachas mikan potter. But if dimensions are less, you're exempt. So here's the story. Okay, here's the story. We'll start with the case I think the more straightforward case. You've got this rock. Got this rock in the middle of Rosh Hashanah, public domain. Everybody's walking around it and everything. But at the end of the day, no one's walking over it and no one's going to be using it. And it's 10 Tvachim high, which we said is how high walls have to be, right, to be a private domain,
Mhm.
and it's got the area of 4x4 tefachim, which is the area you need for a private domain. That rock is a private domain. Doesn't have, no one has to live on it, in it. It is a private domain. It's considered having 4 walls, and it's got the area for a private domain. It is a private domain. And therefore, if there's something sitting on this rock, and you're in the, and you take it off the rock, right? You take it off the rock, and you then put it down in the public domain, you have transferred from a private domain to a public domain. You did haitzah. If you took something from the public domain, the street, and you put it on the rock, you transferred from a public domain to a private domain. That's haitzah. You're liable for it. That's the case of the rock. Now, let's say this rock was not 10 tefachim high. Let's say it wasn't. Or let's say this rock, let's say this rock was 10 tefachim high, but less than 4x4. Then it's not a private domain anymore. And if it's not a private domain anymore, then it's not haitzah.
So what is it?
It could, depending on its dimensions, it could be a carmelis, or a mokum ptur, or part of the public domain. It all depends on what its dimensions are. Now, then we talk about a pit. Now, the pit means like this: if you literally dig a pit in the ground that's 10 tefachim deep, 40 inches deep in the middle of the street, you dig this pit that's 40 tefachim deep, 10 tefachim deep. You got walls 10 tefachim high. You got an area that's 4x4. The bottom of the pit is a rishus hayachid, or the whole thing's rishus hayachid. And if let's say you take something from the public domain and you throw it down down there, you're liable for transferring from a public domain to a private domain. If you're on the bottom there, you throw it up and it lands into the public domain, you transfer from a public domain to a private domain. But that's not the case of the Mishnah. The case of the Mishnah is chuyas habar. That means like this. It used to be that when they used to dig these pits, these holes, what do you do with the dirt? They didn't just throw it away. They kind of built it up around like a small wall around the pit. So they would take it out, right, dig it up, and put it on the side of the hole. So it would form like a little wall around the hole. Now, the case of the Mishnah is, the Mishnah says the chuyas habar, right? The dirt of the pit. Again, if it's 10 high, if it's 4 wide, it's going to be liable. Now, if we were just talking about that, you made this mound of dirt, right? That was 10 tefachim high and 4 wide. That's the same thing as the rock, right?
Mhm.
And if we're just, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about like this. The hole is 5 tefachim deep. The wall around it, that dirt that you put around it, is 5 tefachim high. So from the top of the mound to the bottom of the pit, how much do you have? 10 tefachim. I have a hole that's 5 tefachim deep.
Mhm.
I have the wall around that's 5 tefachim high.
Yeah.
It all combines together to make
Them.
a pit.
Mhm.
And I have, so now what's interesting is about this pit, right?
Mhm.
Now that it's a private domain, so anything from the bottom up or from the street to it, or it from the street, is haitzah. And also, if you take something off the top of the rim, right? Something sitting on the rim, something sitting on the top of that wall, something sitting on the rim of that wall, that's also considered a private domain. So I take off of that and put it on the ground, I've also done haitzah.
Mhm.
So not only is from the bottom, right? But even from what's on top. That's also coming from a private domain to a public domain. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
But again,
you,
one second.
Rabbi.
But if the dimensions don't equal that, right? If it's not going to be a total of 10 tefachim deep, or the area is not 4x4, then it's not a private domain. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're very welcome.